This talk is for January 24th, which places us in this period between Epiphany and Lent, which is why I have this display of wise men up here still behind me to keep us give that kind of an atmosphere to what I'm sharing. I'm also begun this series of talks looking at the Beatitudes from the Sermon on the Mount, and somehow it just felt an appropriate thing to do, and as I've started doing this, that has been confirmed for me. So today we're going to look at the second of those Beatitudes. I started first with a general talk about the Beatitudes, and then last week we looked at the first one. This is now the second. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And I've entitled my talk, Mourning Changes People. Mourning changes people. And now, whenever I use the word mourning in this talk, I'm referring to connecting with grief rather than the time of day, although it might be true that also changes people. When I was 18 years old, the wife of the manager of our local grain elevator gave birth to a child who died shortly after birth. All the women from our small farming community took turns visiting the grieving mother's home to offer comfort. It was the right thing to do. I, on the other hand, quietly wondered why. Though I didn't dare to voice my sentiments out loud, my 18-year-old mind callously told me that the death of the baby was probably for the best, particularly if the baby had some kind of developmental defect. Without being aware of what I was doing, I had chosen to not mourn their loss. It wasn't so many years later that Faith, my wife, and I boarded a plane in Dallas, Texas, a few short hours after our baby son died during a surgery to correct a heart defect. In my grief, I felt anger toward the other passengers who were comfortably unaware that my personal world had imploded. 37 years later now, anytime I hear of a young child with medical challenges, the emotions I felt then return with raw vigor. Mourning changes people. Even though I understood that had our son survived surgery, his life would have been a continual pilgrimage of medical visits and procedures, I desperately wanted him to live. At some point, the memory of that baby's death in my home community penetrated my own grief, and I was aggrieved that I could ever have harbored such insensitive thoughts. My callousness gave way to mourning the loss that couple had suffered numerous years previous. Mourning changes people. Jesus' second beatitude or happiness statement proclaimed, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." That's in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5. We immediately pick up on a progression of thought in the Beatitudes. The first Beatitude declared, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," which I suggested was a challenge to make an accurate self-assessment of both our inadequacies and our potential. It's hard to be honest about who we are, but it's even harder to determine that we need change. That's where mourning comes in. While the idea that mourning changes people is at the heart of the second beatitude, there's also the suggestion that mourning is volitional, that mourning is an act of the will. Mourning, I think, is different than grief. Grief invades our lives unwelcomed, But mourning is choosing to willfully engage that grief. We experience grief anytime something unwanted enters our lives. The illness or death of a loved one, a disability, the loss of employment, the loss of a relationship. Unlike grief that is unavoidable, mourning is the deliberate act of engaging that grief. Our instinctive reaction is often to slam the door on grief so that we don't have to face our sense of loss. We congratulate ourselves for handling grief well when we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and we get on with our lives. That aversion to mourning is particularly visible when it comes to engaging other people's grief. Because mourning is uncomfortable, people who suffer personal loss end up feeling like social pariahs. More than once, I have heard people who have suffered a devastating loss lament the fact that their friends abandoned them. No wonder. They had become like Job in the Bible, for whom answers had become elusive. We excuse ourselves from avoiding grieving people by claiming that we don't know what to say, when the truth is that we find it too painful to enter into mourning. The book of Lamentations in the Bible is helpful in understanding the difficulty we have with mourning. Lamentations famously declared, "There is a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance." I think the writer, generally accepted as the prophet Jeremiah, I think the writer was reminding his readers that it's our choice whether we weep or laugh, and whether we mourn or dance. And because it's our choice, the writer later added, "The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure." Let your mind reflect for a moment on the idea that the wise choose to mourn while the foolish choose pleasure. The writer wanted us to understand, I think, that pleasure is a distraction from the reality of grief, while mourning seeks to understand grief. While there is a time for distraction, for laughing and dancing, as Lamentation states, it's not wise to always choose distraction over mourning. If we avoid mourning, we miss out on the positive change mourning brings us. At its heart, mourning is a reaction to injustice. It was an injustice when our baby died and other babies lived. You may have experienced far greater injustice, or you know people who have. It's unjust when death comes prematurely, or we suffer any kind of random loss. Mourning faces the fact that life is not fair. We can be encouraged that the Bible does not shy away from the unfairness in life. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Romans, spoke of that unfairness when he wrote, "For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God." That's in Romans 8. verses 20 to 21. I take this to mean that anytime we run into a wall of unfairness, we can be encouraged to know that God understands our devastation. And because God understands, Jesus' mission was to correct. According to Luke's Gospel, in Jesus' first recorded sermon, he read the following words from Isaiah 61 about combating injustice. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now, even though these words are tremendously encouraging, had Jesus continued to read, he would also have read, to comfort all who mourn. Those words are from Isaiah 61. Now, probably Jesus didn't need to read the part about mourning because in those days everybody knew the scriptures and they already knew those words were coming. I wonder, though, if his listeners were disappointed that Jesus didn't voice the mention of comfort. After all, whenever we experience injustice, we crave comfort. Or as Jesus said in the Beatitudes, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." All of this leads us to understand that the pathway to comfort is costly, because injustice demands payment. It's costly for us to enter into someone else's grief, and it's costly for us to face the injustices for which we suffer. Now, as costly as the injustices inflicted upon us are, there is another injustice that is even more costly. We can't read Jesus' words, "Blessed are those who mourn," without comprehending that Jesus was not primarily talking about the unfairness of life we encounter that is inflicted on us. Particularly when we link this statement with the previous one, which proclaimed, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," we are forced to accept that Jesus was talking about mourning the injustices we ourselves have inflicted on the world around us. That puts a different spin on things. Jesus would want us to understand that the most damaging injustice is the injustice we ourselves inflict. The theological term for the injustice we inflict on others is that uncomfortable little word, sin. This context leads us to define sin as the injustice we bring into the world. The Bible leads us to understand that the deepest level of mourning results from facing up to our own sin, to the injustice we inflict on God, on other people, and even on ourselves. David, the great king of Israel, is a model of mourning his own sin. David infamously arranged for the death of Uriah the Hittite so that he could take Uriah's wife Bathsheba as his own wife. That act of injustice against an honorable man cost David dearly. But to his credit, he was willing to mourn that sin. That's particularly visible in Psalm 51. And David generally expressed the difficulty of mourning one's own sin in Psalm 32, where he wrote, "When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy on me. My strength was sapped as in the heat of summer. Then I acknowledged my sin to you and did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. David was one who best understood the truth that we can't truly experience comfort unless we have first mourned, particularly when we're talking about the injustice we inflict. We are living during a time when Jesus' words, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted," I think sound particularly inviting. During this past year, it feels like so much has been taken from us. It feels like injustice. We've even been denied the opportunity to mourn in traditional ways. When we mourn the injustices of life, it's important to correctly identify the source of that injustice. With COVID, it's the disease that has been unjust, not our governments, which have sought to control the spread of the disease. And like other injustices, like other injustices, we can pretend that it doesn't really affect us, and we simply focus on moving on. But Jesus reminds us that the successful way to navigate injustices is to mourn the ways they negatively affect us. Not only does mourning those injustices protect us from becoming bitter, mourning is the necessary preparation for receiving comfort. More importantly, the call to mourning demands that we resist the urge to rapidly move on with life and take stock rather of the injustices we ourselves inflict. As I mentioned last time, when we become aware of the injustices with which we treat others and even ourselves, it's not helpful to quickly declare, "That's not who I really am," just so that we can move on and leave it all behind. No. Mourning requires that we own the pain caused by our unjust actions and the injustice our attitudes have caused, and that we confess our wrongdoing. Only then are we able to bask in the comfort that mourning brings. Only then will we benefit from the positive change that mourning delivers.